Mark, thanks for being on the show. As we were talking about before recording, there's a lot of different areas that we want to explore. The one I think I want to start with, because something that you've written about, spoken about a lot, is culture, right? And this notion of being very intentional on how you guys build culture. And you guys are famous for, like having open, transparent salaries, and like really being super transparent, with all company information, at least internally. And for me, the way I see it is almost that, you're a product guy and you're a product visionary, and you're very, you almost equate. I see it as like, I'm going to build a product with a strong conviction, but almost the same way in terms of culture. So curious to hear you about, how you think about building culture, like kind of the core principles you've set out, and then obviously the stuff on the surface that people see, like, transparent salaries, etc. But maybe the core principles you think about.
Yeah, I'm glad that we made it to the famous stage. I don't know how much of that's we fully reached the fame level, but we've definitely been pretty intentional about this stuff. I think, like you said, I'm a product guy, and for me, it was important as I grew in the company to find a way to let go of product. And I think product founders often struggle with that because you're so good at it, you kind of still get really involved into product, and that can only last until a certain stage, and you have to focus on the business itself. And I think you can, the Jedi mind trick for me was to look at the company as a product. And it had, a backlog of feature requests, which could be programs for staff, or they had a list of bugs and things that didn't work, and you had to continuously kind of repay some technical debt, to use really kind of the jargon, where as the company grew, some things that worked at the beginning didn't work after. So it's really that mindset helped me first let go of the product, and then help me kind of, I guess, try to fill the shoes of the CEO, but still leveraging my skills. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I imagine that it's not easy, right? There's always trade-offs. So like, what trade-offs did you have to do when, hey, like, we're gonna share, all everyone's salaries, right? Imagine like it's not made for everyone. So curious to hear you about the trade-offs and compromises you need to make.
Well, so there's kind of two categories of decisions when you make culture decisions or organizational decisions. There's the ones that you can revert and the ones that you can't revert. The reality is most of them are reversible. And once people understand that it's okay to try stuff and we can change it later on, it becomes a lot easier to experiment and evolve. I think that's the first step. It's like people fear change, and change management often in an organization is really hard, and that's what slows us down. But once you're able to ingrain that notion of like, it's okay, like we could just flip it back or change it. So, and experiment also, like almost A/B test some of the programs or features of the company that it offers its employees. That reduces the risk a lot. But things like transparent salaries are not easily reversible. And in particular, like, it's easier if you start with it, for sure. We start with it. So it's kind of a lot easier because there's a contract. Anybody who comes in knows that's part of the deal. If you're turning, salaries that were private public, it's actually, I haven't done that, to be fair, and it's probably a big challenge because when you don't have public salaries, it's a lot easier to make exceptions, right? And you want to hire that person, you really believe in them, you make an exception on the salary off of your standard kind of salary grid. And then there's this exception. And if you're going to make it public, then it creates all sorts of weird situations with the staff. So all of the cheats and hacks and corners you were able to cut when we were private, you can't do them anymore when you've got public salaries. On the other hand, I think the benefits of that far outweigh the effort. And in a company, people talk about salaries all the time. And even though they're not public, in most cases, people know each other's salaries. And it creates a large amount of friction and frustration. When they're public, what I've heard from the staff is like, I looked at the salary grid when I came in first, and I never really looked at it again. And I don't worry about salary because I know they're public, and I know that forces the company to be very thoughtful and thorough about how they do the salary grid, and it's going to be fair for everyone. So it turns out that this topic doesn't become important. It doesn't become part of people's like headspace, and that frees up a lot of headspace and a lot of politics in a company. But yeah, you have to be intentional about these things, and I think there's a lot of companies will work on their culture. They'll say, these are our values, this is our culture, but then they don't operationalize it. They don't walk the talk, but like, and that's the hard part. And it's really going to be a collection of small processes, tweaks, habits you're going to develop in the organizations. And that's the collection that's going to really reinforce that culture and make it real. And that's the intentionality part I think you're referring to. It's like you'll look at what you value in your culture statements and you say, okay, how do we make this a reality? And transparency or public salaries are just one tactic or one program in place to reinforce kind of the core culture pillars at Unito, which are kind of three things right now. They're community, their growth, and their transparency. And those are really the three pillars of the employee value proposition, which you can imagine is similar to your product's customer value proposition, but this time you're doing a value proposition for your staff, which is, again, I think the metaphor of product here kind of translates again.
Yeah, I imagine you're seeing a bunch of advantages just because I find it's also very forward thinking, and a lot of people that that are A players want to work in an environment that's forward thinking about things like culture. Can you point to, without obviously sharing some specific details, let's say you have to go and present to the board, hey, like here's been the impact of what we've done. How has it impacted the organization, be it from, like, let's say, retention rate or attracting quality candidates? So curious to hear you in terms of the actual positive business impact. I know you might not want to share too much because, like, I see it a little bit as a competitive advantage also at the same time.
Yeah. So, I mean, we started a lot with this. So it's not like we have to report on these programs to the board, because when investors came in, that was part of what they were investing in, right? And it did. It's not just for staff in terms of competitive advantage. I think it also attracts strong investors and strong customers that have similar values. But to be fair, like, I don't think we invented anything here. Like, forward thinking, we basically, not to use the word steal, but inspired ourselves of a collection of other programs and tactics and processes that a ton of other organizations have done. And I think it's just this approach of like cherry picking and combining in this mashup of what your company's processes and the way it operates that makes it unique to you. But I don't think we've invented anything new here. We're not the first by far to do public salaries or open salaries. We're not the first at all to put a lot of our programs in, or whether it's like 4-day weeks or things like that. Like, all these things are just, hey, let's try it out. This looks interesting. It could reinforce this culture element or this value that we have in the company. Let's try it out. Let's run kind of an experiment, share it with the company, and then we'll decide if we go on or not.
We all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? There's a lot of companies that, like you said, have worked, and you guys are just the next natural evolution. And I don't know if this is an elegant segue, but obviously we're talking about, work, and I see as the way that you're building culture is a little bit like the future of work, where a lot of companies, I think, are just not there yet. And then when it kind of so happens, you guys are building tools for the future of work. So I'd like to hear you, like, maybe simply, what is Unito? What are you guys building?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we start at the mission of the company is to unite work across tools, teams, and organizations. And, what we just talked about in terms of the culture, the way we operate, really embodies that internally, but it's also what our product allows to do as well. So if you don't know, Unito is a no-code integration platform. It's a bit similar to players like Zapier you might have played with, or Workout or MuleSoft on the more enterprisey side. But we basically allow really deep and seamless integration between SaaS while keeping it really easy for any business user to set up. And our claim to fame, if you want, is that we do bidirectional integrations out of the box. So to give you an example, if you're a marketer and you're living in a tool like Asana or Trello, and you have to work with web developers, working on your website, making changes, and they're working in a developer tool or organizing their work in Jira, well, we'll sync the tasks and issues so that it feels like everyone is working on the same tool, right? But they're not. So you're commenting, asking, giving more information, or attaching requirements and from Asana, and the developer is getting it all in Jira. And as they progress, the status changes, who's it signed, is it done, and all. You see it all from Asana without ever having to leave. That's really kind of the magic that the technology kind of provides to the end user.
What led you to this insight, right? Because now it's been a few years that you're, I think we were chatting before recording, like, we're together. WeWorks, it's been a few years since you launched. What was that initial insight that, said, hey, I want to start another company in this space?
Yeah, so it comes back to I'm a product guy. I've been in product for 20 years, more than that now, I guess. But in product, you have to interact with every team in an organization, right? And you have no authority over any of them, but you still have to interact with, engineering teams, with support teams, with sales teams, and they all have their own tools, and they have all organized in their team on their own processes. So you often are the one has to jump around all the time and just to keep track of what's happening. And so that was me, and it was one of these ideas I had on this bucket list of someone should solve this, right? So it started as a basement project just to scratch my own itch, syncing a couple of tools early on, and it just turns out that we put it out there, and there was other people that had the same problem, kind of thing. So that was the inception, was just scratch your own itch, which is often the easiest way to build a product when you're in your own customer. But it obviously evolved over time and kind of really broadened its scope.
So yeah, since that founding, it maybe gives it a sense of scale, like maybe number of integrations and like just any general metrics.
Yeah, so we're at 30 something integrations right now. And you gotta understand, our roots were really in these use cases that we knew well. So at the intersection of project management, work management tools, and developer tools. And often like business folk working with technical folk. And that's a big piece of friction inside of organization and different tools. So we really built for that initially. And for us, it was really important that this technology that would enable this integration would be bidirectional, because it's a collaborative workflow. And if you're just throwing stuff one way, it's not really collaboration anymore. So we built this technology up for these use cases, and then we discovered along the way that there were a lot more applications for it. And we really broadened it up. And right now we're really focused on continuing on expanding that catalog of integrations. So we have a very differentiated kind of technology and approach on the market and view of the integration space, but we're still at a very niche kind of set of connectors compared to a Zapier that now has like over 3,000 connectors.
Yeah, so it's more focused as a general broad approach. But at the same time, I find it interesting because like imagine the question you get often like from investors, like what's the addressable market for this kind of thing? Particularly one where it's like it's so dynamic and changing, right? It's like as the old adage says, software is eating the world. How do you think about market?
Yeah, so I mean, when we started this, like, no, everybody was like, "What's the market for for this?" And integration in general wasn't necessarily the most appealing of spaces. That changed a lot because this trend towards SaaS, like proliferation, has just been increasing like crazy. I give you some sense. We were looking at some of the metric from an Okta report recently. The number of apps in an organization on average is like 89, and in a larger company, 2,000 employees, it's 187. So, and that's growing year over year consistently. So the fragmentation we're seeing is there, and so the need for integration has just skyrocketed. So we don't get questions about market size anymore, to be frank. It's no longer a question. It's more about, well, now it's a super crowded space, and how do you differentiate in there, and what's going to make your approach win over other solutions.
So what is that approach? How do you answer that?
I mean, there's a few variants of it. Some of them I can't talk about, but really the crux of it is we have a completely different integration paradigm, right? It's based on synchronization as opposed to triggers and actions, which is, or if this then that, is really what you see in all the integration players out there. And that means that if you're trying to do anything that's a little bit sophisticated in terms of integration, especially if it's bidirectional or tries to go deep in terms of the fields or the information that it integrates, you're going to have to do a lot of work. And it becomes just as much as programming, even though there's no code. And so people don't go that far. Whereas with the synchronization approach, for us, it takes a couple of minutes to set up a bidirectional flow out of the box. So for us, it's really like we're both easy to use for non-technical people, and we go really deep on integration.
Yeah. Considering how dynamic the market is, do you think about like a big ambitious goal that you want to attain? Like we want to get to X, size, or do you think about it more like, hey, the pie is so big and changing that, like let's set an annual objective and keep trying to crush it. Like curious how you think about, like a long-term vision for the company.
Yeah, I mean, on a personal level, again, the product guy in me is like, how can I solve the hardest problem possible for the largest amount of people possible. And there's nothing that beats the kind of the reward of like solving the problem that nobody else is solving, or is even trying, for this very large amount of people. So, we're broadening our catalog of integration. We think that our technology is going to be applicable to a very large breadth of companies, because ultimately what we found is that a company's most valuable workflows or business processes are the ones that cross multiple teams or departments, because they deliver value to customers, or they execute internal operations, or they serve customers. And those are the workflows that are the hardest to implement, because they cross those boundaries, and because they have to cross all these little software pieces that each create their own little silos. So ultimately, for us, it's not necessarily, we think that the integration market is going to have a lot of big winners in it, because it's such a broad need these days. And SaaS has become this really interesting space where it's a lot of point solutions that if you pick one that's designed for your need, your use case, it's going to make you that much more efficient, that much more productive, and that much more happy at work. But then if you expand this and everybody's doing that, you're creating all these little pockets of software that creates a lot of friction at the organizational level. So when I look at an organization in the future of work, I see SaaS tools as being almost Lego blocks, and each of the Lego blocks has this really specialized function, but you still need to assemble them into a workflow, right? That is going to be your business operations or your business workflows. And so integration plays a really critical role in this building, in the assembly side, because the blocks themselves are not designed to fit into each other. You need kind of a connective tissue in there, right? And so integration, it has never been the sexiest of spaces. It's like plumbing, and everybody needs a plumber eventually. But I haven't heard a lot of people getting really excited about plumbing. But when you put the power of assembling these things together into the hands of a business user, I think it gets really, really exciting.
Yeah, I don't think plumbing is the right analogy, because it feels like plumbing is like yeah, of course it just works. It's in the background. So that, I think that piece is the same, but I think it's where the ROI comes in, where it's like, I think it's much more valuable. Something that people are probably not taking for granted right now. So curious to hear you, like, when you measure, return on investment, like why people are buying your product, right? So is it a notion of like time saved, productivity? So how do you measure that when you're pitching a customer?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Like we obviously measure on a time save, because it's pretty concrete. You could say, well, right now you're paying a human to basically do copy pasting across different systems, or to kind of run around and ask where people are at, or kind of updating people, creating all these manual reports. And instead, you can have them live, and you don't have to do this manual ordering. It reduces a lot of errors. So there's kind of a simple time kind of calculation. But ultimately, I think organizations that don't embrace this agility of adopting modern workflows that are able to combine wherever people work, without having to force people off and in other places, they're going to have a huge competitive advantage in the market. And I think we are seeing a lot more of those forward-thinking organizations. And if you think of the acceleration of COVID towards remote work, I think the idea that knowledge workers now are expecting to work at any time, kind of from anywhere, but not just physically, but also digitally, then this notion of like they will want to work from the tools that they want, that they like. And there's some really crazy stats about, I think it's almost 50% of US workers would be willing to leave their job if they weren't happy with the tools that they had at work. Like that's important, right? So from an ROI, there's talent retention and attraction, there's time saving, but there's also agility and competitive advantage in your industry.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it's one of these that it's still so early, and in terms of like where you guys are going. So curious to hear about your any growth blockers today. So are there any constraints that are limiting your growth potential today?
I mean, limiting the growth potential. That's an interesting question. I mean, for us right now, we're still a big fish in a large pond with our very specialized integrations. And whenever you need, you have a collaborative workflow or you hit our core use cases, we're typically the better solution on the market. But it's still a pretty narrow set of connectors, right? So for us, it's really about how do we expand that offering so that we can be that solution for an organization. And that's for us, that's the main growth vector for us as a business. And we look at every integration that we build as almost a new market that you're opening. So we don't think of geographies because we're a product-led growth company where it's inbound. We're in a bunch of like every country in the world almost. And we think of our geographies as more integrations that we build. So if we build an integration to Salesforce, suddenly we open up the entire Salesforce customer base as a new market for us. So it's really about how do we strategically pick the integrations, build them out in the right way, and then go to market with those, often leveraging the partner or doing the right content for the customers.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's like if I let's say like in my investor hat, is the limitation then just like more capital? Like if you had that magic wand kind of question, it's like, is it just more capital to like deploy more integrations, or do you still need that validation of like, hey, we're not just going to build anything willy-nilly, even though there's probably a gazillion ideas that you guys have? So like I imagine there's a little bit of both, right? But curious to hear you.
Well, you never want to build anything willy-nilly. So there's a certain strategy in terms of which categories and in what order you do things. And I think we've developed our playbook to do that in a sensible way. Then after that, it's like at what speed are we going to capture? Are we going to build out or leverage the community to build out or things like that? And obviously, capital can be one of those tools in your tool belt to accelerate that velocity, but it's a means to an end, right? It's not a necessary blocker per itself. And so we've always wanted to keep capital as a means to an end and not an end of itself, right?
Yeah, it's not one of these like like grow at all costs kind of like a approach that you see often used in other markets, like kind of like quintessential examples of a capital almost like as a weapon. But it seems again it goes back to like you're thinking more deeply about how we're going to build products. Maybe more of a geek question, like any integrations that surprised you the most over the past year?
So in the fall, we expanded into data tables, spreadsheets. We added like Notion and Airtable, and we added Google Sheet. And we were pretty surprised by the traction of Google Sheet. I mean, and in one way, it makes sense. They have like 200 million users or so. But it's surprising because when you're in the tech space, Google Sheet isn't considered necessarily the latest and greatest of shiny tools, right? And we think of Airtable and Notion as these very fast growing, raised a lot of capital and sexy businesses, if you want. And a lot of people in the tech space love those tools. But it's really a reminder that there is the rest of the world there, and they're a much bigger audience, and they're still using a lot of the tools that they're familiar with. And Google Sheet is one of that universal tools, or same thing for Excel. Like people go back to it because they've become really proficient about it and they're comfortable. And I think that was a good reminder that changing people is hard. Like changing where they work or forcing them off a tool is a losing battle. So instead, let them work where they want and go where they work and make that the norm and just solve the problem of all the siloing instead. But Google Sheet has been hitting some pretty amazing numbers.
Yeah, that's amazing. Man. That's amazing. It's like I used to be very proficient in Excel in a former life. So it's like I still consider myself not too bad, but Excel will outlive all of us. Like there will be like it's for sure going to be used at 100 years. Like nothing's going to like fundamentally disrupt Excel today, right? So it's like I think it's a good product lesson of like. Sure, you can go after like the shiny new object, but sometimes it's like just what are people using, right? So it's like actually understanding core customer needs. But it goes back to like you said, the mass, right, where people use, and you guys fall into making products easier, right? This whole move like no code movement. What are outside of the buzzword of this, like what are misconceptions about this trend? Like what do you see as maybe more important or misunderstood?
Like specifically about no code?
Yeah.
Well, I think no code, like it's one of these terms like PLG, and probably is another one of those. It's kind of just renaming something that existed a long time ago and made it more sexy or kind of new. But I do think that the no code is part of it's related to what we see in terms of the maker movement not so long ago, which was about building more on the hardware side, and it's about this this desire to build things on yourself without having to depend on specialized people or specialized skills. And we're seeing it in many places, like in design as well. Like, do you have to go to a graphic artist to be able to publish a blog post and put an image on it? Or can you do it yourself? And can you do a podcast without having, an audio engineer or whatnot? Like, it's this ability and desire for people to create things on their own, and I think that's a very powerful movement. And when we look at SaaS, it's the same thing. Like, people now, a business user can try, can deploy, can buy a SaaS tool on their own. They don't need servers or IT or anything like that. And that's why I think integration is such a key part. It's that last bit that they still need technical people today. If they want to, they get this new tool that's going to make them like so much more advanced and competitive, but then it has to work with all the rest of the stuff, and they can't do that themselves. I think that desire to be able to solve the problems themselves is here to stay, and any platform that helps people solve the problem on their own is going to hit that nerve. And I do think that that's kind of the future. Organizations then have major challenges, right? This brings a whole new set of challenges to the organization, because we've always said IT is overwhelmed, and now, now it's going to be even harder to keep track of it.
Yeah, it's like exponent 10, basically, right? It's
Yeah,
going to get even harder. Like, I think there's the natural, like, oh shit, like you said, I think you mentioned before, right? Like the remote world, people understood that technology is going to be playing a much more important role in our lives as it gets easier. What are you most excited about? Like, maybe is like a sub trend of that. Anything that you're spending your time on thinking, even though that let's say day to day in the product anymore is CEO, but I imagine it's still it's still the core of what you guys do. Curious as to like how you think about things that excite you today.
Excite us about the business or excite us in the world in general?
I would say either or.
Either or. I mean, very day to day. I'm excited to be back in the office today and see some people, but that's another story entirely. It's a good question. It's building the organization and scaling and growing it is both extremely challenging, but so exciting at the same time. And for me, I really appreciate being able to craft the organization and create an environment where people in the organization can all do like the best work of their career. And that's my kind of personal ambition for the team internally. And I've said this to too many people by now, but like, I really dream that everyone who goes through Unito, the day they retire eventually, and hopefully filthy rich and all, and they look back, I really dream that they consider their time at Unito as the time they did the best work of their career, the whole careers, not so far, the whole careers, right? And so because I think if we manage to do that, the company is going to be successful, because it's really a combination of all its people. So how do you create an environment, an organizational environment where people can do the best work of their careers? And that's something that I spent a fair amount of time thinking about and dreaming about, right? And it's part of, you have to let go a bit of the product, because if you create that environment for your team, they will create an amazing product and they will serve your customers really well. And that's kind of how my mind has shifted over the years.
Yeah, it's like that old expression, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you have the right people, put them to work. And I find it's an interesting juxtaposition. I imagine from the outside, it's like obviously a very technical field. You mentioned like maybe not as sexy, or at least maybe not used to be as sexy, but it's like your philosophy around it being really human focused more than anything else, right? So it's like I find that quite inspiring. Of like, hey, let's get people and like have them work the best that they can to their abilities, right? So push them beyond their current competencies, let's say.
I think that's where we're heading. Like all of this, technology is not going to replace human. They're going to enable them and empower them and supercharge them to do what they're best at, and get rid of the stuff that they're not great at, or that's repetitive and that's wasting their time, and really allow humans to do what they're amazing at. And there's still a lot of things that they're amazing at. So technology for me is really an enabler for that.
Yeah, I can't think of a better way to end this interview, Mark, on such a high note, right? Where it's like enabling people to work on creative elements and not mundane Google spreadsheets all day, and like really helping them, work on what people are good at, which is not mundane stuff, but super creative, challenging tasks. So, yeah, it sounds like it's part of a long journey that you guys have embarked upon.
Yeah, and it's not over. So thanks for having me, Nectar. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And well, final question, Mark, and considering what you guys are building, if people want to get in touch and learn more about the work that you're doing, what's the best way?
Unito.io, or follow me on LinkedIn. But yeah, Unito.io, and we have some great content in there. We also share a lot of, we've curated a lot of our best practice internally into a website called the betterworkplacetoolkit.com, which is also on Product Hunt. And it has a lot of content from like local companies like Office Vibe, but also some of our partners like GitLab, around transparency, around diversity, and some really concrete tools like some of our own like growth tools and how we evaluate people and stuff like that. So yeah, good resource there.
Mark, continued success. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.